They beat this Doberman puppy until he was almost dead. What happened next will break you. I saw him drive a metal pipe straight into the chest of a Doberman so hungry it trembled just for looking at a fallen scrap of sandwich, and the crack that followed cut the air with the sharpness of breaking bone. My mind didn't have time to sort fear from rage before one question rose so fast it burned. How does a man become that cruel? The thought lingered like heat trapped in a furnace. It hurt. Noon in Bakersfield felt like the sun had come down to melt the ground itself, and as I walked toward Rust Creek salvage yard, the waves of heat bending upward from rusted steel sheets made the air look warped and unreal. The stench of burnt oil, spoiled trash, and heated metal formed a thick layer against my lungs, as if breathing meant pushing through someone else's fist. Even before I stepped inside, I heard yelling from within the yard. It wasn't the kind of yelling that left room for mercy. When I shoved open the heavy metal gate, the first thing I saw was a Doberman pup, so gaunt its ribs looked ready to break through its skin, shivering on a concrete slab stained with oil. Its head hung low, but its eyes stayed locked on that old sandwich scrap lying half an arm's length away, as if that forgotten piece of bread was the last thread tying it to life. 3 men stood over him like shadows that had learned to enjoy being dark. I knew exactly who they were. Roy Gallows, the owner of the yard and the subject of at least 8 complaints we'd logged, twirled a length of metal pipe with a twisted smile on his face. Beside him stood Tyler Briggs and Mark Blade Henson, 2 men who had long crossed the line between force and hobby, wearing violence like it was part of their daily routine. Tyler snorted and said, "Look at him," shaking like he's about to snap in half. Blade nudged the sandwich scrap with his boot, rolling it farther away. The Doberman tried to crawl after it on instinct alone, then collapsed again, and something in me cracked. From the office at the far corner of the yard, Helen McBride, 63, small resolute, came running out, her voice shredded to the sound of paper tearing. "Roy, stop it, I'll call the sheriff." Roy didn't even turn. He just lifted the pipe again, savoring the trembling creature at his feet. I don't remember whether I screamed first or ran first, only that the sound of my boots crunching through gravel hit my ears louder than anything I'd ever heard, and my heartbeat hammered like metal being driven into a wall. By the time I reached the open yard, Roy still hadn't noticed me. He brought the pipe down again. The clang of metal hitting flesh rang out, and the pup, Jet, though I didn't know his name yet, curled in on himself with a sound so faint that if the yard hadn't been stone silent, I might have missed it. Helen's scream cut through the heat. "Dear God, Roy, enough!" Roy answered her with a short laugh, the smug sound of a man convinced no one here could touch him. Then he heard it, the metallic groan of my gate opening, and the yard froze. I stood behind him, sunlight flashing off my sheriff's badge boots, still dusty from Riverbank Road, and if anyone had been watching, they might have thought I looked calm, but the heat inside me felt hotter than anything rising from the scrap piles around us. Tyler stepped back. Blade dropped his gaze. Only Roy stayed still, pipe in his hand, smile wobbling as his chest rose and fell the way cowards breathe when they realize the room has changed. I looked down at the Doberman lying at his feet. The pup tried to lift his head toward me. There was no hope in his eyes, just a single silent question: is today the day someone stops them? I lowered my voice. No shouting, no threat. Just 3 words, each one striking metal. "Step away, now." The whole yard turned colder than steel. Roy looked at me, then at the pipe, then at the dog. And in that moment, I knew had I arrived 5 minutes later, that scrap of sandwich would have been the last thing this Doberman ever saw. I didn't know who he was, didn't know where he came from. But in that blistered yard under that merciless sun, one truth cut through everything. If I hadn't stepped between him and those 3 men, Jet would have died right there. I've seen my share of bad yards in my years as a deputy, But Rust Creek's salvage yard carried something different in its air, something heavier than grime or heat or danger, something like a silence shaped by guilt. The rusted sheets of metal and the broken machinery felt like witnesses that had watched too many things no one ever bothered to write into a report. Heat coiled around my legs as I stood in the center of that place, my hand tightening on my duty belt out of habit. The whole yard felt like it was holding its breath. The smell of burnt oil clawed up my throat, mingling with the metallic dust that hung thick enough to taste, and the California sky above was so white it seemed to blur at the edges. My name is Luke Sanderson, deputy of Kern County, for almost 14 years canine handler for 7 years before that. I thought I'd seen every form of neglect until the sight of that starved Doberman lying in a puddle of hot oil forced me to take a long, steady breath just to keep my voice from breaking. Jet, though I didn't know his name yet, lifted his head when he saw me, not out of hope, not out of trust, not because he believed I was any kind of salvation. He lifted it because he was so desperate that any movement I made might mean I was reaching for the scrap of sandwich he still thought he might get. That kind of hunger isn't physical. It's survival bleeding into instinct. The yard's silence was wrong. No workers, no grinding engines, no metallic crashes common in places like this. Just the pop of heat under my boots and the fragile, fading breaths of the animal, waiting for something worse that hadn't arrived yet. The quiet made everything louder. Helen McBride stood trembling at the office doorway, looking at me the way someone drowning looks at the only piece of driftwood left on the water. I called you several times," she gasped. "They've been doing this for months." I faced her. "You've seen them beat him before." Helen nodded hard. "He's starving. He comes in here looking for food. Roy hates dogs, says they ruin his yard. But I swear, he's never hurt anyone." I didn't need her to swear. One look at Jet curling himself into the wall, trying to disappear into the oil-stained concrete, told me he'd been hit more times than any animal should endure. Far across the yard, the metal sheet wall bent and wrinkled, like the scar tissue of this entire town, and Roy stood there with his 2 men close at his sides. His smile held nothing human in it. "What are you checking for, deputy?" he asked, his voice steady in the practiced way of someone who thinks the law can't touch him. I held his eyes. "Noise complaint," I said. "And to see if this yard is hiding anything more interesting." Tyler spat on the ground. Blade shrugged, as none of this mattered. But I recognized the look beneath their masks, the same one I'd seen in domestic violence suspects and in brothel raids, and in the eyes of men who only felt powerful when someone else was small. It's the look of borrowed confidence. It cracks fast. Jet's eyes made it hard to breathe. It wasn't pity tightening my chest, it was memory. I once had a canine partner named Ranger lost during a chase 5 years ago, and he had the same eyes. Eyes asking, "Is anyone on my side?" Helen moved closer to the dog as if she could shield him with nothing but her thin frame. "Please," she whispered, her voice nearly gone. "Take him out of here." I scanned the yard. Rear gate locked. Fence over 10 feet high, topped with barbed wire. A place like this wasn't built just to keep metal in. It felt like it was built to keep secrets from escaping. I knelt beside Jet, the stench of oil on his fur so strong it burned my nose, and when my hand brushed his skin it felt fever-hot dry, too thin, more like paper than living hide. Roy stepped closer. "You're seriously thinking about taking him?" he scoffed. "Deputy, that's a stray. No chip, no owner, no paperwork. He's trash in this yard." I rose slowly. "I don't see trash," I said. "I see a life." Roy barked a laugh sharp enough to sound like metal snapping. "In Rust Creek," he said, "we decide what deserves to live." I buttoned my chest pocket, the small motion like settling into a fight that was no longer avoidable. Well, I said, calm, deliberate, every word cutting as bright as sunlit steel. Today is the day you stop deciding. Jet exhaled a thin, wavering breath at my feet. I hadn't touched him yet, but he still turned his head toward me, not out of trust, but because for the first time in his life, someone stood between him and the men who hurt him. And right then, in the dead heat of that rusted California yard, I understood one truth. This story wasn't ending here. It was only the beginning. I've walked into a lot of scenes in my years as a deputy, burned out houses, bar fights gone wrong. Drug camps, even rooms so silent I could hear the shape of despair. But standing in that oil-soaked yard felt like the ground itself was holding me in place, forcing me to witness every moment without giving me permission to walk away. And when Roy planted himself between me and that starved Doberman, the truth hit fast. The dog wasn't the only thing trapped here. The whole yard, its heat, its stillness felt like it was hiding a deeper kind of crime. I lowered myself and moved toward Jet the same way I approached injured canine dogs back in the day. No sudden motion, no command, just slow breaths, steady steps, and eyes kept low so he wouldn't mistake me for another threat. Roy spoke first. "Deputy, you don't have to put on a show for it. It's a stray." I didn't look at him. I just said, "Then why beat it like this?" Silence settled in again. I knelt, the hot oil burning straight through my knees, and Jet lifted his head a fraction, those amber-brown eyes trembling, not trusting, but not terrified of me the way he was of the three men behind him. I offered my hand, not to touch, just close enough for him to see it was empty. No leash, no stick, no pipe, just a hand. Jet stared at it longer than I expected, like he was calculating whether touching that hand might earn him another blow. "It's all right," I whispered. "I'm just checking your injuries." He inhaled slowly, weakly, then brushed his nose against my fingers, a touch so light it felt like it would break if I moved too quickly. Helen, trembling nearby, pressed a hand to her chest. "I've never seen him go near anyone," she said, her voice thin. I touched the oil-soaked fur at his neck, and heat pulsed through my palm, far too much heat for a dog left in the sun this long. His chest rose and fell fast, each breath sounding like it scraped its way through a dry, burning throat. "How long?" I asked Helen. 4. "Maybe 5 days," she said. "He comes in for food. Roy says he ruins things, and they've been hitting him harder every day." Behind me, Roy laughed. "Dogs that cause problems need teaching, that's all." I stood and faced him. "Teaching," I repeated. "You call that teaching?" Roy shrugged, glancing at the pipe. "Deputy, you act like you've never seen a stray." I stepped closer, not treated like this. Tyler moved forward, scowling as if he wanted to intimidate me. "Deputy, this is private property. If you want to talk," I cut him off. "If it's private property, why does this dog have a sandwich scrap from your trash?" Tyler's mouth snapped shut. Blade kicked at the gravel and looked away. I returned to Jet and checked his legs. One of them was trembling so hard it barely held weight. He looked at me with the same eyes I'd never forgotten from the night Ranger died, eyes of a dog who knows that if help doesn't come right now, it won't come at all. A shaky breath warmed my hand as I slid my arm beneath his belly. Roy squinted. "You're really going to carry it out of here?" I didn't answer. I lifted Jet just a little, and in that moment he didn't resist, didn't growl, didn't snap from fear. He simply leaned into me as if his body had decided for him. If anyone can save me, it's this one. I rose fully, pulling him against my chest. His weight so light I felt like I was holding an oil-soaked jacket instead of a living creature. Helen covered her mouth, tears spilling. "Oh God, thank you." Roy took a step forward. "Deputy," he said, "you don't have the right." I turned, eyes locked on his. "Roy, you want to finish that sentence?" He froze. Tyler swallowed hard. Blade dropped his gaze. I adjusted my hold on Jet, making sure he was steady, then spoke slowly, each word aimed right at the 3 men who had done this. From this moment on, this dog is no longer under your control, and in the tightening heat of that cursed yard I knew the truth. I hadn't just pulled Jet away from death. I'd stepped into a fight those 3 men wouldn't let go of easily. But right then, all that mattered was the faint burning breath against my arm. If there's any moment in my years as a deputy that's carved into me for good, it's the second I lifted Jet out of that shimmering pool of hot oil, his body so light it felt hollow, as if the life inside him had been beaten out long before I arrived. The smell of the oil clung to my uniform, but what unsettled me wasn't the stench. It was the sharp ridge of his ribs under my hands, like thin steel bars pressing straight through his skin. "Deputy." "You can't take it," Roy shouted, as if he'd only just realized the situation was slipping beyond his control. I turned, with Jet held tight against my chest. "Roy," I said, "I'm not leaving a living creature to die here." Tyler stepped forward. "It's a stray. Nobody cares." I stared straight at him, my eyes fixed. "I care." The yard fell so silent I could hear the metal around us expanding in the heat. Helen stood behind me with her hand over her mouth, her eyes shining with fear. "They won't stop," she whispered. "If you leave, they'll follow." I knew she was right. I saw it in Roy's stare, the look of a man who hid fear behind violence and believed his authority wasn't bound by any law. I adjusted my grip on Jet and walked straight toward the gate. No threats. No warnings. No need. If I had looked back, I know I would have seen Roy wearing the smile of a man who'd just marked me as an enemy. Outside the yard, the heat eased slightly, but Jet trembled harder, so I set him gently on the passenger seat of my patrol truck and slid a jacket under his belly to shield him from the hot vinyl. He looked at me not with gratitude, but with the wild uncertainty of an animal trying to predict the next blow. I opened a water bottle, poured a little into my palm, and held it near his nose. He sniffed, pulled back, sniffed again, then gave one small, fragile lick. "Good," I murmured. "Take your time." I shut the door and moved to the driver's side. Helen hurried over with an old towel. "Cover him from the sun," she said. "Even if... I don't know how long he'll last." I took it with a nod. "Thank you, Helen. I'll update you when I can." As I started the engine, Roy, Tyler, and Blade stood pressed against the fence, 3 dark silhouettes in the brutal sunlight. They didn't speak, but their stare said enough. This isn't over. I didn't let it stop me. I backed out and headed toward the Kern County Veterinary Clinic. It was a 15-minute drive, and the whole way there I listened to Jet's breathing thin, sharp fluttering, like wind slipping through a sheet of torn metal. Halfway down Riverbank Road, his body jerked in a small tremor, and I reached over to steady him. "Jet, you're all right. Stay with me." I didn't know why that name came out of my mouth. Maybe because of the sharp, dark glint in his eyes, or maybe because he reminded me of Ranger, my old K-9 partner, who bled out in my arms after a stray bullet found him. I knew I was letting emotion creep into the job, but I didn't care. At the clinic, I carried Jet inside, and no one asked a single question. Maybe because they saw his condition, or maybe because whatever was on my face told them not to. Dr. Monroe, 50 years old and sharp as a scalpel, guided us into the emergency bay. She ran her hands over Jet briefly. "Doberman. 10 months. Severe emaciation. Critical dehydration. Full body bruising." Each word felt like an indictment, not against the men who hurt him, but against the reality that one forgotten yard could turn a dog into a breathing corpse. Monroe didn't look up when she said, "If he goes to the shelter, he'll die within days. We're overloaded. They're overloaded. Dogs in this condition, they get labeled dangerous fast." "It's not his fault," I said quietly, eyes never leaving him. I know Monroe replied, her tone soft but razor-edged. But the system doesn't care. I said nothing. I hated that answer more than anything. After 20 minutes of fluids and a rough initial exam, Monroe returned. He needs 48 hours of monitoring. But if you want deputy, you can file for temporary foster, as long as you can keep him safe. I looked at Jet, sleeping now, breathing a little deeper. I thought of Roy, of the yard, the way he looked at me when I carried Jet out. I knew this wouldn't be simple. I knew those men would come looking. I knew I wasn't just removing a dog, I was stepping straight into a fight with men who didn't fear the law. But I still said, start the paperwork. I'm taking him home. Monroe nodded. Today, you saved his life. I looked at Jet, skin and bone and nothing else, and answered no. Today, I just pulled him off the first cliff. The hard part starts now. I drove Jet home under the dim, ashen light that Bakersfield afternoons sometimes sink into the kind of light that feels heavy enough to settle in your lungs, and the road along Riverbank was so empty I could hear his breathing more clearly than the engine. He lay on the passenger seat with his head resting on my jacket, trembling at every pothole like his body was nothing but loose, damaged pieces trying to hold themselves together. My house is a single-story, weather-worn place with faded wooden siding, a patch of dry grass, and a half-open garage that always lets the wind slip through. It's quiet there. I carried Jet inside and spread an old army blanket over the concrete, and he was so light I barely felt his weight when I set him down. But the moment his paws touched the floor, something struck me hard. For the first time he looked around not to escape, but to make sure no one was coming to hurt him. My place is a little old, I murmured, unsure if he understood, but it's quiet. No Roy here. Jet stayed still, his head lowered, though his ears twitched slightly when I placed a bowl of water near him. He looked at it like a trap, sniffed it, pulled back. Then, after a few seconds, I took one cautious lick. I sat on an old milk crate a few steps away, saying nothing, not reaching out, not touching him, just letting my presence be the kind that didn't hurt. I learned that in canine training sometimes the best way to earn a dog's trust is to give him enough space to choose you on his own. An hour passed like that. He shifted his legs, changed positions, breathed a little deeper. By the time darkness fell, I brought him the wet food Monroe had given me at the clinic, and Jet stared at the bowl as if he didn't believe it was meant for him. Then he looked at me, then at the bowl again. I set it down and stepped back. 1, 2, 3. He lowered his head and ate, not ravenously, not in panic, but with the fragile caution of a creature who had learned that food can disappear the moment it arrives. Even while eating, he kept glancing toward the garage door as if expecting someone to rush in and take everything away. But no one did. No footsteps. No clang of metal. No cruel laughter. Only insects in the yard and his own ragged breathing. And then his tail moved. Barely. A tiny, skeletal twitch of hope. On the second morning, I woke earlier than usual, and when I opened the garage door, Jet lifted his head to look at me, not with trust, but without the reflexive flinch I'd seen the day before. For a dog beaten for months, that tiny change meant more than most people would ever understand. I placed a fresh bowl of water down. He drank more than the night before. Then he stood, wobbly legs shaking, but he stood. I stepped back so he wouldn't think I was crowding him. After a few seconds, he lowered himself again. Helen stopped by around noon with a bag of food she'd bought from her small paycheck. "Oh my God," she whispered when she saw Jet. "He looks better than yesterday." Jet glanced at her, then looked away, but when she knelt and placed her hand on the floor, he lifted his head again. Not afraid, just acknowledging her. "I told you," she smiled softly. "He knows who's good." I didn't answer, but I knew she was right. On the third night, while I was writing the incident report at the kitchen table, I heard footsteps in the garage, not the frantic scramble of fear, but the tentative sound of a dog trying to approach without breaking his invisible safety line. I opened the door. Jet wasn't lying where he had been. He was standing, weak but certain, with his head tilted slightly toward me, and his eyes had changed. Not empty, not defeated. Something closer to measuring me. Not yet trusted, but not a threat either. I knelt and placed my hand lightly on the floor. "Good boy," I whispered. "Go at your own pace." And what happened next is something I know I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Jet stepped toward me. One step, then another, until he laid his head on my knee, soft, tentative, like a small voice saying, "I'm trying to believe you." I placed my hand on his back for the first time without needing to lift or steady him, and he didn't flinch. He exhaled a long, deep breath, the kind that only comes when a creature finally stops bracing for pain. That night, with the garage dark and the door cracked open for fresh air, I understood something simple and immense. Jet was no longer in the stage of surviving fear. He was stepping into the stage of wanting to live. And that was where everything truly began. 3 days after Jet was stable enough to stand, the Bakersfield heat shifted in a way I didn't like. A dry wind carrying dust from Rust Creek salvage yard high into the air. And somehow I knew tonight wouldn't be quiet. A dog beaten to the edge of death doesn't stiffen at the dark for no reason. But Jet stood at the garage doorway all evening, his body rigid as a tension cable, his eyes locked on the road in front of my house as if he expected something from his past to step back into the light. I sat at the kitchen table going through Roy's file again. His record was suspiciously clean, too clean to be real. And as I read, the motion sensor light outside snapped on a sharp white beam, cutting straight through the glass. Jet growled, not the sound of a frightened creature, but the warning rumble of a Doberman recognizing the scent of the man who nearly killed him. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the back door. Footsteps scuffed across the powder-dry dirt, trying to stay quiet and failing. And when I glanced at Jet, he wasn't hiding, wasn't shrinking away. He pressed close to my leg, ears pricked, muscles drawn tight, his body remembering something long before his mind had time to label it. Protect. "Stay here," I signaled with my hand. He didn't move far, but his eyes never left the fence line. When I stepped into the yard, the porch light flicked on again, and a black pickup sat under the tree with its headlights off. The window cracked open, and Roy's voice slid out smooth and cold as raw steel. "Sanderson, come talk a minute." I shone the flashlight directly into the truck. "Roy, you're on my property." "True," he said with a thin laugh, "but that dog you've got in your garage, he's mine." Jet snarled the second he heard those words, not from instinct, but memory. Memory of pain and wire and hot oil and the laughter of 3 men drunk on their own power. I stepped forward. "No," I said. "That day, the only thing you owned was cruelty. The dog wasn't yours." Roy leaned out the window, his eyes slick beneath the street lamp. "Deputy, you don't understand. That kind of dog, I cut him off. I understand perfectly. Enough to know you won't lay a hand on him again." In the brief silence that followed, I could see him calculating. Men like Roy always think violence is the easiest language to speak. The truck lurched forward, not fast, but quick enough to count as a threat. Jet shot past me like a black arrow, planting himself between me and the bumper body, upright and unflinching. He didn't bark. He simply stared at Roy, eyes deep and steady, with a single vow: not again. Seconds stretched long as minutes. Roy stared back. Jet didn't move. And for the first time I saw Roy blink. He didn't win by pushing forward. He won by backing off, but his voice left a cut behind. "This isn't over, Deputy. If you think you can keep it from me forever, you're dead wrong." The truck rolled back, kicked up a storm of red dust, and disappeared into the dark. When the engine noise finally dissolved into the wind, Jet turned toward me. He trembled, but not from fear. I knelt down and he rested his head against my shoulder, not in submission, not in dread, but like a soldier completing his first battle beside the person he'd chosen. I placed my hand on his neck, feeling his rough, determined breaths. Good boy. You did damn good. In that moment, I realized his healing wouldn't come from food or medicine alone. It would come from facing the shadow that broke him and standing tall anyway. The Bakersfield night settled back into stillness. Jet lay beside my leg as I locked the door, not shaking, not hiding. He slept for the first time without jolting awake, and I understood then he wasn't a victim anymore. He was becoming something Roy never imagined, a spirit that would not break. The morning after Roy pulled his truck up to my gate, the Bakersfield air felt strangely gentle, the sunlight thin as mist instead of the usual harsh glare, and I stood on the porch as Jet stepped out of the garage with a steadier stride and eyes that were sharp yet peaceful, as if the night before had been wiped clean from his body. He lifted his head toward me, and the look he gave held no fear and no suspicion anymore, just acknowledgement. Simple quiet, but clear enough for me to understand I'm here. I'm alive now. I dialed Sheriff Donnelly and reported everything that happened during the night, and he listened without interrupting before saying only one thing. Luke, this time we take it all the way. And we did. Helen wrote a long and exact detailing every strike she'd seen, and Dr. Monroe provided medical reports on the full extent of Jet's injuries. The photos I'd taken that first day, ribs jutting like blades, bruises blooming across his skin, the hot oil burning into his coat, were submitted alongside them. 2 weeks later, the search warrant and charges were signed. Harris Salvage Yard was no longer a place where secrets could hide under scrap metal. Roy was arrested at the yard gate at the very spot where he once stood laughing while Jet trembled in burning oil. I stood a few yards away as they cuffed him. He looked at me, and for the first time there was no swagger in his eyes, only emptiness, as if he finally understood that the thing he had beaten was the very thing dragging him down. When the legal dust settled for the moment, I went back home. Jet lay in the yard, head resting between his front paws as if guarding a territory he'd only just learned belonged to him, and when I sat beside him, he shifted his head toward me. No rush, no hesitation, just trust. I ran my hand from behind his ear down his neck, and for the first time he exhaled a long, deep breath, utterly relaxed, unguarded, full. It didn't need words, but it said everything. I'm safe. That afternoon, Helen stopped by with a new collar, black with a silver clasp, already engraved with the name I couldn't imagine calling him anything else by now, Jet. He deserves a home, she said. I nodded, and he found the right one. Jet stood gently, pressed his head into her hand, and she broke into tears, not from pity, but from watching life return to a creature who had only known pain. By evening, Jet and I sat together on the front steps, the sky clear and the wind soft, the trees casting long shadows across the yard. I placed my hand on his chest and felt his heartbeat, strong, steady, alive. Jet, I whispered, you don't belong to that place anymore. You belong where there's light, where there's freedom, where someone looks at you not as yard trash, but as a life worth loving. He leaned his head against my shoulder. No bark, no whine, no words needed. Sometimes the bond between a person and an animal doesn't start with grand moments. It starts with something small. A dog who's been beaten choosing to rest his head on your shoulder because to him it's the safest place in the world. And in that moment I realized something I hadn't let myself believe in a long time. I didn't just save Jet. Jet saved the part of me I thought had gone numb years ago.